My suitcase hit the porch with a brutal thud, clothes spilling onto the cold concrete. Frank stood in the doorway, chest heaving, face twisted with rage I'd seen building for weeks. "If you ever come back here," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth, "I'll finish this for good. Do you understand me?" I stood there in bare feet, the November air cutting through my thin shirt, trying to process what was happening. This was my father. The man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd carried me on his shoulders at parades. Now he was throwing me out like garbage. "Dad, please," I started, but he slammed the door so hard the frame shook. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. Then the chain. Then complete silence. I stood there shaking, not just from cold but from the finality of those sounds. Metal on metal, locking me out of the only home I'd ever known. The porch light clicked off, plunging me into darkness. That's when I understood. He wasn't making a point. He wasn't teaching me a lesson. Frank was serious. I was truly homeless, truly alone, truly erased from his life. I couldn't move from the porch. My legs wouldn't work, my mind couldn't process where to go. Through the front window, I could see Frank pacing in the living room, phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried through the glass. "She's gone," he said to someone. "Not left. Not moved out. Gone. Like I'd died. Like I'd never existed. What happened?" Uncle Paul's voice, tinny through the speaker. "Doesn't matter. She made her choice. She's dead to me now." The words punched through my chest. Dead to him. "My name is Megan Sullivan, and that was the night my father killed me without touching me. I was 23 years old, working part-time at a grocery store, trying to save enough to finish my business degree. I'd made the mistake of questioning one of Frank's decisions, of standing up to him in front of his friends. He couldn't tolerate that. Couldn't tolerate anyone, especially his daughter, making him look weak. I finally moved, stumbling down the porch steps to my car. My phone was dying, battery at 4%. I scrolled through contacts, trying to think of someone who might help. But Frank had spent the last hour calling everyone we knew, poisoning the well before I could even ask for water. The screen went black. Dead phone, dead daughter. I drove to Aunt Caroline's house first. She lived 20 minutes away, had always been kind to me, had called me sweet when I was younger. Surely she'd let me stay one night, just until I figured things out. She answered the door in her bathrobe, face tight with discomfort when she saw me. "Megan, honey, I can't," she said before I'd even asked. "Your father called. He explained everything." "Explained what?" My voice cracked. "That you disrespected him. That you've been causing problems for months. That he had to make a hard choice." She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I love you, sweetie, but I can't get in the middle of this. Frank's my brother." I tried my cousin's house next. Then my grandmother's. Then family friends who'd known me since I was 6. Every door had the same answer. Frank had already called. Already told his version. Already made them choose. And every single one of them chose him. I wasn't just homeless. I'd lost my entire identity, my whole support system. Everything I'd thought was solid ground had dissolved beneath my feet. At my cousin Troy's house, he at least had the decency to look guilty. "You should stop pushing him," he whispered at the door. "He's dangerous when he's like this. Just stay away." The word dangerous echoed in my head as I walked back to my car alone. I spent that first night in my car in a grocery store parking lot. The same store where I worked, actually, though my shift didn't start until morning. I reclined the seat as far as it would go, pulled my jacket over me like a blanket, and tried not to think about the fact that this was my life now. My phone was dead. No charger. I'd left everything in the rush of being thrown out. But I had my car, and I had the clothes in that suitcase. That was it. No money beyond the $40 in my wallet. No place to shower. No idea what happened next. I found myself scrolling through old voicemails I'd saved over the years. Before my phone died, I'd backed them up to the cloud, sometimes listening to them when I felt alone. There were dozens from Frank. Birthday messages. "Hey princess, happy sweet 16. Encouragement when I'd been nervous about a test. "You've got this, Meg. I believe in you." Voice messages from a father who'd loved me. Or at least performed love convincingly. Now they felt like evidence of something that never existed. I deleted them one by one, watching years disappear. But I couldn't delete the last one. The message he'd left just before throwing me out. I needed to keep it. To remember who he really was. The next morning, after my shift started, I borrowed a coworker's phone charger and listened to that final voicemail again. Frank's voice, cold and deliberate. "If you think you can come crawling back here, think again. You step foot on my property, and I won't call the police. I'll handle it myself. Do you understand what I'm saying?" The threat was crystal clear. This wasn't anger. This wasn't a father losing his temper. This was control slipping, and Frank couldn't tolerate losing control. I challenged him in front of his poker buddies, questioned his decision about a family investment. In his mind, I'd humiliated him. Made him look like he couldn't manage his own daughter. And Frank Sullivan never looked weak. He'd rather destroy me than admit fault. I saved the voicemail to 3 different places. Cloud storage, email, voice recorder app. Not because I planned to use it, but because I needed proof for myself that this was real. That I wasn't overreacting or misunderstanding. My father had threatened my life. And I decided, sitting in my car during my lunch break, that I would never beg him again. Never apologize for standing up. Never give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I would survive this. And I would do it without him. 2 weeks later, I found a job in Riverside, a town 60 miles away. Far enough that I'd never accidentally run into anyone who knew Frank. Far enough to disappear completely. It was a low-level administrative position at a mid-sized consulting firm, answering phones and filing paperwork. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but they didn't ask many questions. I used my mother's maiden name on the application. Sullivan felt like a brand, marking me as Frank's property. When they called my references, I'd listed my college advisor and a former manager from the grocery store. People who knew me, not him. I slept in my car for another week before scraping together enough for a security deposit on a studio apartment. The place was tiny, barely larger than a decent bedroom, with water-stained ceiling tiles and a refrigerator that hummed too loud. But it had a door that locked. A bathroom. A bed. It was mine, and Frank couldn't touch it. My pride was bruised. Everything I'd thought my life would be had evaporated. But something hardened inside me during those first months. Something that wouldn't break again. My boss, Veronica Hayes, noticed during my second week. "You're overqualified for this," she said, watching me reorganize the entire filing system. "Why are you really here?" I earned trust slowly at Hayes Consulting. I didn't oversell myself or try to climb too quickly. I just worked. Stayed late when others left early. Volunteered for projects no one else wanted. Learned everything I could about the business. Veronica started giving me more responsibility. First, client intake forms. Then research projects. Then sitting in on meetings, taking notes, observing how deals were structured. I enrolled in online classes at night, finishing my business degree one course at a time. It took 3 years instead of 1, but I graduated with honors. Frank never knew. No one from my old life knew. For the first time since childhood, I wasn't Frank's daughter. I wasn't defined by his reputation, his expectations, his control. I was just Megan. And Megan was proving to be more capable than anyone had expected. Including herself. Clients started requesting me specifically. My insights were sharp, my work thorough. Veronica promoted me twice in 2 years. By my 4th year at the firm, I was managing my own accounts, bringing in revenue, building something Frank couldn't diminish. A promotion opportunity opened up in year 5. Senior consultant. Real salary. Real authority. But it required submitting full legal documentation. Including my real last name. Sullivan. The name I'd been hiding from. I stared at the paperwork for 3 days before filling it out. My last name still felt dangerous, like a weapon pointed at my chest. What if Frank somehow found out where I was? What if he made good on his threat? But I couldn't hide forever. And more than that, I didn't want to hide anymore. Sullivan was my name too. He didn't get to take that from me along with everything else. I submitted the paperwork on a Friday afternoon, my hand shaking slightly as I handed it to HR. The woman barely glanced at it, just smiled and said congratulations. Over the weekend, I kept checking my phone. Expecting something. A call from Frank. A message from a relative telling me he knew something. But nothing came. Monday morning, the promotion was announced. My full name in the company newsletter. Megan Sullivan, Senior Consultant. If Frank saw it, he never reached out. If any family members noticed, they stayed silent. It was like I'd truly disappeared from their world. Like Frank's declaration had been so absolute that no one even thought to look for me anymore. The realization was chilling. And somehow, liberating. I smiled for the first time in 5 years. Really smiled. Because I understood something powerful, I was free. Years passed. 5 became 7 became 10. I advanced steadily at Hayes Consulting, eventually becoming a partner. I bought a house, small, just 2 bedrooms but entirely mine. No landlord, no lease, no one who could take it away. I dated occasionally, though trusting people remained difficult. I had friends, but kept them at a careful distance. The wound Frank had left didn't heal so much as it scarred over, becoming part of my landscape. I thought about him sometimes. Wondered if he ever regretted what he'd done. If he looked at old photos and felt anything beyond satisfaction at exercising his control. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. He'd erased me from his life. I returned the favor. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April, I received a certified letter at work. My assistant brought it to my office, noting that someone had to sign for it. The return address was from my hometown. The handwriting on the envelope, careful and rigid, was unmistakably Frank's. My hands went cold as I opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages, single-spaced. I read it slowly, feeling something twist in my chest with every line. Frank was sick. Something with his liver, treatment expensive, prognosis unclear. And he was broke. The business he'd been so proud of was failing. He needed help. Financial help. But more than that, he wanted me to come home. The letter was stunning in its presumption. Frank wrote as if nothing had happened. As if 10 years ago, he hadn't thrown me onto a porch and threatened my life. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just expectation. Family takes care of family, he'd written. I know we had our differences, but blood is blood. I'm asking you to put the past behind us and help your father in his time of need. Our differences. Like we disagreed about paint colors. Like he hadn't disowned me and turned every person I loved against me. The audacity made me laugh, a bitter sound that echoed in my quiet office. He'd included his phone number, his address, the same house he'd thrown me out of, and a note at the bottom. Please come home, Megan. We can talk through everything. I set the letter down and stared out my office window for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it. To let him face whatever was coming alone, the way he'd forced me to. But another part, the part that had spent 10 years building something from nothing, was curious. What had brought Frank Sullivan, the man who'd rather die than admit weakness, to his knees? I didn't respond to the letter. But I did start researching. And what I found was grimly satisfying. Frank's reputation had collapsed slowly, then all at once. I traced the timeline through public records, business filings, and a few careful calls to people who didn't know who I was. His construction company, once thriving, had been hemorrhaging clients for years. Projects delivered late, over budget. Complaints about shoddy work. Legal disputes. He'd burned bridges with every major contractor in the county, his arrogance finally catching up with him. The same traits that had made him throw out his daughter. Inability to accept criticism, refusal to admit fault, explosive anger, had destroyed his business. Clients didn't come back. Partners didn't renew contracts. Workers quit and spread word about his management style. By the time I started digging, Frank was barely holding on, taking whatever small jobs he could get. And now he was sick, medical bills piling up, the house mortgaged beyond its value. He'd called me because he had no one else left. Everyone else had already walked away. I sat with this information for weeks, turning it over in my mind. Then I received a call from Veronica. "Interesting project just came in," she said. "Local operation, small town, failing business. They need a consultation on restructuring and financial recovery." She paused. "The address is in your hometown." My stomach dropped. "What's the company name?" "Sullivan Construction," she said. "Owner is requesting our best consultant." She paused again. "That's you, Megan. Your name is listed as lead." The irony was almost too perfect to be real. Frank's company was failing so badly that his creditors had mandated outside consultation. They'd hired Hayes Consulting without knowing I worked there. Without knowing Frank's daughter, the one he'd disowned and threatened, was now the person who would evaluate his business, determine whether it could be saved, hold his future in her hands. I could have refused the assignment, cited conflict of interest, let someone else handle it. But I didn't. "I'll take it," I told Veronica. She looked at me carefully. "You sure?" I saw the owner's name. "Sullivan." "That's my father," I finished. "Yes. But that won't be a problem." She studied my face. "Megan, if this is personal, it won't be," I said firmly. "I'm a professional. And I'm the best person for this job." That was true. But it was also true that I wanted to see Frank's face when I walked in. Wanted him to understand, finally, what I'd become without him. What I'd built from the wreckage he'd created. I spent 2 weeks preparing. Reviewing every document, every filing, every complaint against Sullivan Construction. The picture that emerged was ugly. Mismanagement, shortcuts, angry clients. Frank's business hadn't failed because of bad luck. It had failed because of him. And I wasn't going to lie to save him. The day I walked into Sullivan Construction, I wore my best suit. Navy blue, perfectly tailored, paired with heels that clicked confidently on the concrete floor. The office was smaller than I remembered from childhood visits. Dingier. The smell of sawdust and motor oil hung in the air, mixed with something stale. Desperation, maybe. Frank's assistant, a tired-looking woman named Holly, greeted me at the front desk. "You must be Ms. Sullivan from Hayes Consulting," she said. "Mr. Sullivan is expecting you in the conference room." I followed her down a narrow hallway, my heart beating faster with each step. The conference room held a long table, papers scattered across its surface. 3 men sat waiting. One I didn't recognize. One was Frank's longtime foreman, Carl. And one was Frank. He looked older. Thinner. His face had a gray tint that spoke of illness and stress. But his posture was still rigid, still projecting authority he no longer possessed. He glanced up as I entered, irritation crossing his features. "We asked for their best consultant," he said to Holly. "Not some." Then he actually looked at me. Really looked. His face went slack with shock. The color drained completely, leaving him ashen. "Hello, Frank," I said calmly, professionally. "I'm Megan Sullivan, senior partner at Hayes Consulting. I'll be conducting your business evaluation." The room went absolutely silent. Frank recovered faster than I expected, years of controlling situations kicking in. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against concrete. "This is completely inappropriate," he said, voice tight. "There's a clear conflict of interest here. I want a different consultant." I set my briefcase down on the table with deliberate calm. "You requested Hayes Consulting's best analyst. That's me. If you'd like to lodge a formal complaint with my firm, you're welcome to do so. But I'm here, and I'm qualified, and your creditors have already signed off on this arrangement." Carl looked between us, confused. The other man, someone from the bank I assumed, was watching with careful interest. Frank's jaw worked. "Everyone out," he ordered. "I need to speak with Ms. Sullivan privately." "Actually," I said pleasantly, "this is a business consultation. All relevant parties should remain." The power shift was subtle but absolute. Frank was used to giving orders, to having them followed without question. But he wasn't in control here. I was. He sank back into his chair slowly, and I saw something new in his eyes. Recognition. And fear. Let's begin, I said, opening my laptop. I've reviewed your financials, client complaints, and project histories. We have a lot to discuss. For the next 2 hours, I walked through his failures methodically. Every late project, every cost overrun, every client lost. Frank tried to interrupt, to justify, to shift blame. I shut him down professionally each time, citing documentation, showing patterns. By the end, his authority was shredded. And he knew it. After the meeting ended and the others left, Frank approached me in the parking lot. I was loading my briefcase into my car when I heard his footsteps. "Megan, wait." His voice had changed. The command was gone, replaced with something closer to pleading. I turned slowly, keeping my expression neutral. "We need to talk," he said. "Not about the business. About us. About what happened." "What happened?" I repeated flatly. "You mean when you threw me out? Or when you threatened to kill me if I came back?" He flinched. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. "You meant them," I said. "And you made sure every person in our family turned their backs on me. You didn't just kick me out. You tried to erase me." "I made mistakes," he admitted, and I could see how much the words cost him. "But you're here now. You've done well for yourself. We can move past this." The presumption was breathtaking. Move past it? "Frank, you're only talking to me because you need something. Because I'm holding the clipboard and the answers and your future." His face tightened. "I'm your father. You stopped being my father 10 years ago." He stepped closer, voice dropping. "I need your help. The business, my health, everything's falling apart. You're the only one who can fix this." I looked at him directly. "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here to evaluate whether your business can be saved. That's all." "But you could help me," he pressed. "You could recommend. I'll review the facts," I interrupted. "And provide an honest assessment. That's what I'm paid to do." His expression crumbled slightly, reality settling in. He needed my approval to survive. And I owed him nothing. Frank tried several more times over the next week to speak with me privately. He'd wait by my car, show up during my lunch break, call my office asking for meetings. Each time, I remained professional and distant. "If you have business questions, we can discuss them in the scheduled consultation meetings," I told him. "Otherwise, there's nothing to talk about." "Megan, please," he said during one of these attempts. "I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong. Can't we just talk? Father to daughter." "We're not father and daughter anymore," I replied. "You made that clear 10 years ago. Now we're consultant and client. That's the only relationship we have." He never apologized. Not really. He'd say things like "I made mistakes," and "things got out of hand," but never the actual words. Never "I'm sorry for what I did to you." It was classic Frank. Asking for help while refusing to acknowledge the full weight of what he'd done. Expecting forgiveness without offering genuine remorse. I took detailed notes during every interaction. Not for revenge, but for clarity. To remember who he really was when his performative vulnerability tried to soften my resolve. Meanwhile, my audit of his business continued. And what I found was worse than I'd initially thought. Years of cutting corners, paying workers under the table, skimping on materials. The problems weren't just financial. They were ethical. Structural. Frank hadn't just failed. He'd built his failure into the foundation of everything he did. My report to the creditors was thorough and unflinching. I documented every instance of mismanagement, every pattern of poor decision-making, every red flag that suggested this business couldn't be saved without complete overhaul. I didn't sabotage Frank. I didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. "The business model is fundamentally unsound," I wrote in my executive summary. "Leadership has demonstrated consistent inability to accept feedback, maintain client relationships, or operate within ethical guidelines. Without significant structural changes, including new management, recovery is unlikely." I recommended a full independent audit of the company's finances and practices. The creditors agreed immediately. Frank found out during a meeting I wasn't present for. He called my office afterward, furious. "You're trying to destroy me," he screamed into my voicemail. "After everything I gave you, this is how you repay me." I saved that message too. Added it to the collection of evidence showing who Frank Sullivan really was. The audit was scheduled for 3 weeks out. I knew what they'd find. Years of financial irregularities. Shortcuts that violated building codes. Payment disputes swept under the rug. Frank had operated like a king who believed rules didn't apply to him. The same way he'd treated his family. Now the truth would work through his business like water through a cracked foundation. Inevitable. Impersonal. Complete. The audit results came back even worse than expected. Falsified receipts. Materials purchased from unlicensed suppliers. Multiple safety violations that Frank had ignored. The creditors called an emergency meeting. Frank sat at the head of the table, still trying to project authority, still refusing to accept responsibility. "These findings are exaggerated," he insisted. "Taken out of context. Every contractor deals with these issues." The lead auditor, a woman named Victoria, looked at him with cold professional disdain. "Mr. Sullivan, these aren't minor infractions. These are systemic problems that put workers and clients at risk." Frank turned to me. "Tell them. You know the industry. You know how things work." I met his eyes calmly. "The findings are accurate. I've reviewed them thoroughly." "You're lying," he said, voice rising. "You're doing this because you're angry. Because you want revenge for something that happened years ago." Victoria frowned. "Mr. Sullivan, Ms. Sullivan's evaluation has been corroborated by independent auditors. Her personal relationship to you doesn't change the facts." But Frank wasn't listening anymore. He was unraveling, right there in front of everyone. Pointing fingers, making excuses, blaming everyone except himself. It was exactly how he'd blamed me 10 years ago. For questioning him. For making him look weak. For refusing to simply accept his version of reality. The board asked me for my final recommendation. I gave it clearly, without emotion. Complete restructuring under new management, or closure. Frank was escorted from his own building that afternoon. I found Frank in the parking lot after the meeting, sitting in his truck with his head in his hands. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered standing barefoot on a porch in November, listening to locks clicking, watching a light turn off. I remembered sleeping in my car. Remembered being turned away by every person I'd thought loved me. He looked up as I approached, and his face twisted with rage and fear and something that might have been grief. "You did this to me," he said, voice shaking. "You destroyed everything." I stopped a few feet away, keeping my distance. "No, Frank. I didn't do this to you. You did it to yourself. I gave you everything," he spat. "Raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head. And this is how you repay me." "You threw me out," I said quietly. "You threatened to kill me. You turned everyone against me and left me with nothing." "You disrespected me," he countered, like that justified everything. "In front of my friends. Made me look like I couldn't control my own daughter." "Control," I repeated. "That's what this was always about. Not respect. Not love. Control." He climbed out of his truck, unsteady on his feet. "I'm your father." "No," I said firmly. "You were my father. Then you chose to stop being one. Now you're just a man who made bad choices and has to face the consequences." He stood there, this man who'd once seemed so powerful, now just broken and small. "Do you hate me?" he asked finally. "Is that what this is?" I considered the question carefully, then told him the truth. "I don't hate you, Frank," I said. "I survived you. There's a difference." The words seemed to hit him harder than anger would have. He stumbled back slightly, leaning against his truck for support. "I raised you," he said again, like a mantra. "Everything you are, you owe to me." I almost laughed. Everything I am, I built after you tried to destroy me. I rebuilt myself from nothing, with no help from you or anyone you poisoned against me. I was protecting my reputation, he tried. You embarrassed me. What was I supposed to do? Act like a father, I said simply. Accept that your adult daughter had thoughts of her own. That questioning you wasn't betrayal, just independence. He shook his head, refusing to hear it. You were always difficult. Always had to push back. I asked you one question, I reminded him. About a bad investment. That's all it took for you to throw me away. Silence stretched between us. Cars passed on the street. Somewhere inside the building, people were packing up Frank's office, boxing his career. I'm sick, he said finally, playing his last card. The treatments are expensive. I have nobody. You had somebody, I replied. You had a daughter. But you chose to erase her rather than admit you might be wrong. I turned to walk away, and he called after me. Not as a command. As a plea. Megan. Megan, please. I paused, looking back at him one last time. Goodbye, Frank. Then I walked to my car and drove away, leaving him standing alone in the parking lot. Just like he'd left me. The aftermath played out over months. Sullivan Construction officially closed 3 weeks later. Frank lost the business, the building, most of his assets. The house went into foreclosure shortly after. I heard these updates through professional channels, not because I was following his decline but because our business communities overlapped. Frank tried reaching out several times. Calls to my office that I didn't return. Letters that went unanswered. Even a message through a mutual business contact, asking if I'd consider a meeting. I declined every attempt. There was nothing left to say. Friends from my old life began reaching out too, awkwardly, tentatively. People who'd turned me away 10 years ago now wanted to reconnect. To explain that they'd been caught in the middle. That they'd always felt bad about what happened. I was polite but distant with most of them. Some relationships, once broken, can't be rebuilt. Too much trust had been shattered. One afternoon, Aunt Caroline showed up at my office unannounced. She looked older, uncomfortable in my professional space. I wanted to apologize, she said. For not helping you when you needed it. For choosing Frank over you. Why now? I asked. Because Frank told everyone his version. We believed him. We didn't know, you didn't ask, I interrupted gently. You took his word without ever hearing mine. She cried. Said she was ashamed. That she wished she could go back and do it differently. But apologies don't erase a decade. They don't give back the years I spent rebuilding alone. I thanked her for coming, and she left looking smaller. Frank sent one final message 6 months after everything collapsed. It arrived at my office in a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter, several pages long. His handwriting was shakier than before, less controlled. I read it slowly, sitting at my desk after everyone else had gone home. He apologized. Really apologized this time. Not mistakes were made or things got out of hand, but actual admission of what he'd done. How he'd let pride and anger destroy his relationship with his daughter. How he'd been cruel and wrong. How he'd spent years justifying his actions until he couldn't anymore. I told myself you betrayed me, he wrote. That you were ungrateful, disrespectful, deserved what happened. But the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of being questioned. Afraid you'd see me for what I really was. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Didn't expect reconciliation. Just wanted me to know that he understood finally what he'd done. You were right to walk away, he concluded. I destroyed the best thing in my life because I couldn't stand the thought of being wrong. You deserved a better father. I'm sorry I wasn't one. I set the letter down and stared out at the city lights for a long time. Part of me had wanted this apology for 10 years. Had imagined him finally understanding, finally admitting fault. Now that it was here, I felt only emptiness. The apology was real. But it was also too late. Too late to give back my 20s. Too late to restore the family I'd lost. Too late to undo the trauma of being erased by the person who was supposed to protect me. I never replied to Frank's letter. I kept it, filed away with the voicemails and documents from 10 years ago. Evidence of a journey from destruction to something like peace. But I didn't respond. Closure doesn't require reconciliation. I'd learned that slowly, painfully, over the decade since he'd thrown me out. Healing isn't about the person who hurt you finally understanding what they did. It's about building a life where their understanding no longer matters. I moved forward, took on new clients, expanded my consulting business, bought a larger house with a real yard, adopted a dog, built friendships with people who'd never known me as Frank's daughter. 6 months after the letter, I heard through professional channels that Frank had moved to Arizona. Living with a cousin there, working odd jobs, trying to manage his health issues with limited insurance. The mighty Frank Sullivan, reduced to depending on family charity. The irony wasn't lost on me. But I didn't take satisfaction in it. Didn't feel vindicated or victorious. Just sad. Sad for the father-daughter relationship that could have been. Sad for the man who'd let pride destroy everything. Sad that it had taken complete collapse for him to finally see himself clearly. One evening, I found myself looking at old photos. Pre-discernment pictures where Frank smiled at the camera with his arm around my shoulders. Young Megan grinning, believing her father was proud of her. I studied those images, trying to reconcile them with what came after. Then I put them away. Not destroyed. Just filed. Part of my history, but not my present. A year after Frank's final letter, I was invited to speak at a business conference about crisis management and ethical leadership. Standing on that stage, microphone in hand, I found myself telling a version of my story. Not all the details. Not the personal anguish. But the professional truth about what happens when leaders prioritize control over integrity. I once witnessed a business owner who couldn't accept feedback, I told the audience. Every suggestion was seen as attack. Every question as betrayal. That inability to be challenged destroyed relationships, drove away talented people, and eventually collapsed the entire operation. I didn't name Frank. But I used the lessons his failure had taught me. True strength isn't about never being questioned, I continued. It's about having the courage to admit when you're wrong. To adapt. To value truth over ego. The audience nodded, taking notes, unaware they were learning from the wreckage of my father's pride. After the speech, during the Q&A, someone asked, "Have you ever faced a situation where someone you consulted couldn't be saved?" I thought about Frank in that parking lot. About his business closing, his world crumbling. Yes, I said carefully. Sometimes the damage is too deep. The patterns too entrenched. In those cases, the kindest thing isn't rescue. It's honest assessment and the space to rebuild differently. The questioner nodded, satisfied. But I was thinking about something else. About how I'd become the person who could stand on this stage. How Frank's attempt to erase me had paradoxically forced me to become more solid, more real, more certain of my worth. I stood in my home office on a Sunday morning, looking at the framed degrees on my wall. Business degree I'd finished online while sleeping in my car. Professional certifications I'd earned while building a career from scratch. Awards from clients whose businesses I'd helped save. This was my life now. Built deliberately, carefully, without anyone's permission or approval. The woman Frank had tried to erase had created something he could never touch. My phone buzzed with a text from Veronica. "Great job on the conference speech. Proud to call you partner." I smiled, texting back a thank you. These were my people now. Colleagues who respected my work, friends who valued my presence, a life constructed on my own terms. Sometimes I still thought about that night on the porch. The cold concrete under my bare feet. The sound of locks clicking. The porch light going dark. Those memories still existed, still hurt in quiet moments. But they no longer defined me. Frank had tried to write my story as one of failure and erasure. Instead, I'd written a different ending. One where the daughter he'd thrown away became stronger, more successful, more grounded than she'd ever been under his roof. One where his cruelty became the catalyst for my independence rather than my destruction. The greatest revenge wasn't destroying him. It was building a life so full, so meaningful, so entirely mine that his opinion of me stopped mattering completely. He tried to make me disappear. But I'd done something better. I'd become visible on my own terms, to people who mattered, in ways that actually counted. Frank had to live in a world where his discarded daughter thrived without him. Where she'd become exactly what he'd claimed she'd never be. That was karma. Not dramatic or immediate, but absolutely complete. I closed my laptop, called my dog, and headed out for our morning walk. It was a beautiful day. And I was free.